Success! Oh, hi. Glad you're here. I'm glad to be with you. I just wanted to. I broke my record. I follow me on Letterboxd at Paul Charman. See that? That's me. Okay? Look, you can't see that. No? Look. See? Yeah? Yeah, whatever. At Paul Charman, the Muad'Dib. Little picture of Captain Murphy. From C Lab. I broke a 25-year-old record held by Star Wars Episode 1 The Phantom Menace, which I saw in theaters back in 1999 after camping out, midnight showing. Anyway, 19 times during its original theatrical release, and then when it was re-released just over a decade ago for 3D, I saw it 3 more times. So I've seen Star Wars Episode 1 The Phantom Menace in theaters 22 times. The other day, like 2 days before it came out on digital, I saw Dune Part 2 in theaters for the 23rd time. So I've seen Dune Part 2. Well, I'm in the middle of my 25th viewing, but in theaters. 1 IMAX, a dozen Dolby, yada yada, 23 times. Granted, Star Wars Episode 1 The Phantom Menace is about to be re-released in a couple of weeks, and I'll be seeing it at least twice, and I'll probably catch Dune Part 2 one more time before it leaves my theater. So they're probably going to end up tied at 24. But, the point being, I've seen Dune Part 2 a lot. So I reviewed it. I did a reaction, I did a review in 2, and I did a long in-depth spoiler review. However, seeing this film so many times, every time I watched it, more came to mind. More came to mind. More came to mind. More came to mind. To the point where I could only do my initial Letterboxd review. I kept adding to every single time I saw it. I was taking notes. Add more, add more, add more, add more. So after 23 viewings, I finally finalized my Letterboxd review. The point being, I couldn't have possibly have said everything I would want to say about this movie in my initial spoiler review. So I was like, man, well, what about this? What about that? What about this? Well, maybe I should just consolidate all my notes and then make another final review. Discuss, thoughts, feelings, emotion, I don't know. But throw in all that stuff that I wouldn't have been able to think of just making an off-the-cuff review. And then I was like, well, I already did that. All of my notes, if you will, are in my Letterboxd review now. Because I've added to it. It's by far my longest review ever. So I thought the only logical thing to do for me to stop yammering, as I already have for like 4 minutes, the only logical step is to read my Letterboxd review. That way I can cover everything I have to say about this film. And mind you, I will have more to say about it every single time I watch it. But I'm going to cut off. Like, if I haven't thought of it yet, okay, fine, whatever. But there will be more in the future, I'm sure, and I won't mess with this, because this movie is an amazing, triumphant masterpiece that requires multiple viewings for you to even wrap your mind around it, and every viewing after that, you're just going to notice more and more brilliance about it. I still have yet to, now I'm planning on, now that I own it, I got to catch up with Part 1, because I've seen Part 1 31 times. So here in about a week or so, once I get caught up with Part 2 and have seen that 31 times, my 32nd viewing will finally be my first viewing where I watch 1 and 2 back to back. Very much looking forward to spending 5 hours of Dune just boom. I'm gonna knock them both back. I haven't seen part one since I've seen part two, as a matter of fact. So I'm looking forward to that. And then after that, for my 33rd viewing of each, I'm going to watch them both at the same time. Because yes, there are so many matching. These movies are like twins. They overlap in many ways. But no more rambling. Let me just plow through this, then we'll be done. Okay? I'll have said my piece. So this is my personal review of Dune Part 2 on my Letterboxd account, Paul Charman, Charman. Follow me. It's a good time. Okay, so here we go. So again, a lot of this was written after my first viewing, some of it after my second or third viewings, so on and so forth. Little bits and pieces were added a total of 23 times. Okay. Dune Part 2, 5 stars. And I liked it. Believe it or not, I liked this movie. Jamis lives. Jamis. I've been saying Jamis for years, and then it was Jamis, because it's Jamis in the original sci-fi miniseries that made me a fan of Dune in the first place. And then I thought maybe just a couple people pronounced it differently in part 1, and then I finally get to part 2 and everybody's saying Jamis, and I'm still trying to get out of the habit of saying Jamis. It's either one, whatever. But it's supposed to be Jamis. It's Jamis. Let's go with Jamis. Okay, sorry. Shutting up. But not really. Jamis lives. It's official. We have reached the pinnacle of cinema. It's all downhill from here. At least until Dune Messiah. Mind you, I wrote all of this before they even announced Dune Messiah, but I knew that we were going to get a Dune Messiah because of the poster clues. I have YouTube videos about those poster clues. I already knew. They already knew that they were making Dune Messiah before Dune Part 2 even came out. I promise you that. Anyway, sorry. Sidetracked. They could have called this How to Walk Like a Badass, the movie. Timothée Chalamet is now officially the master of walking like a badass, whether it's through the dust, on the desert, or into a room. This was one of the greatest theatrical experiences of my life. This must have been what it felt like in '77 when Star Wars was projected on the screens for the first time. I have never seen anything like this. I have never felt anything like this. I wouldn't even know how to describe it. There were moments that were so swelling emotionally with the cinematography and the music that I wept. For no other reason than being completely overwhelmed and unable to comprehend that what I was witnessing was something that was actually real. I was misty-eyed before the opening logos because it was already giving me everything I wanted, and it continued to do so. Referring to the Lunging Bagir. I was like, they better start part 2 like that. I love how the big climactic swelling music cue occurs during and for a first kiss. Epic. Watching this was like begging for a unicorn for Christmas, knowing I won't get one, because they don't exist, so that's not possible. And then Christmas morning, I get a unicorn. How is this possible? But within minutes I realized what this film was doing, and it was blowing my mind. I'm thrilled that it ended up being 2 parts, because I have never seen a 2-part story told in this way, where part 2 perfectly mirrors everything that happens in part 1. And when I first realized it was when Jessica drinks the water of life near the beginning, and I'm like, this is the same scene as when Paul does the Gom Jabbar and puts his hand in the box. Music cues. I'll go on. It's like the Pink Floyd Dark Side of the Moon Wizard of Oz thing, which, after realizing this, I finally watched Wizard of Oz while listening to Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon. It is pretty cool. My favorite being how the song Money kicks in right when it transfers to color. Anyway. Because they're hitting the same beats. Oh, right. I want to watch part 1 and part 2 at the same time because they're hitting the same beats. The music will be similar, but different. There's a lot of music cues that are the same. Part 1 begins with Paul waking up from a vision. Part 2 begins with Paul waking up from a vision. In Dune Part 1, Paul asks, why not save the water instead of watering those palm trees? And he's told that the palm trees are sacred. Around the same point in the runtime of Dune Part 2, Lady Jessica is told that they're saving the water because it is sacred. Part 1 has the shot of the Harbinger carrier dropping it off and leaving due to its malfunction. In Part 2, there is the same shot of a perfectly functional carrier, only this time it's crashing from an explosion. In Part 1, the Reverend Mother tells Paul silence. And in Part 2, Paul tells her silence. These films are like identical twins with different personalities. Everything that was happening was a mirror image of the first one. The message, the drums, over the opening logos, the voiceover, opening the film, the first and last shots, the music, the water of life mirroring the Gom Jabbar box test with Paul standing outside the room, fearing her death. Just like Jessica was standing outside the room, fearing his death in Part 1. The Baron in a bath and or naked, plus I loved him as Jabba the Hutt. His introduction in the Harkonnen Arena was very Episode 1. And most importantly, spoiler alert. This is where we get into spoilers in case you've made it this far. Jamis is my favorite character. And for 3 years, I have been wishing Denis Villeneuve would put him in Part 2, since we still had options with possible futures that never came to pass. That was how we got to know Jamis in the first place. I was teary-eyed through probably half of this experience, but when Jamis not only started out as present in the story, whether it was his body or his name, then Paul started bringing him up, and they were hinting at what was to come. When I heard and saw Jamis on screen, I wept. True story. And once again, around the same point as Part 1. He had important, profound words of wisdom that are necessary to put Paul on his trajectory. So that was one thing I thought was impossible and I would never get in this film, but I got it. This film meets and exceeds expectations. When Paul gives his big speech, it's about the same point in the runtime as in Part 1 when Duncan dies. And both scenes are using the same music. Both parts feature the ring seal being used, but the Emperor deserved worse after not actually touching his lips to that ring. Part 1 ends with Zendaya having the final line and the final shot is on Jessica. Part 2 ends with Jessica having the final line and the final shot is on Zendaya. I love how when everyone kneels for Paul at the very end, the only two still standing are his two women, the only two who don't believe in him. And it cracks me up that when earlier in the story Zendaya asks Paul, "Will you always be with me?" he responds with, "As long as I breathe." But at the end, he has to update his status and let her know, "Oh, hey, by the way, I will love you as long as I breathe. But I gotta go marry Florence Pugh real quick." Part 1 has Paul's father telling him he cannot take such risks. Part 2 has Josh Brolin asking why Paul takes such risks. I love how they kept showing close-ups of Raban's whip in both parts 1 and 2. Then at the end of Part 2, when he's finally got it in his hand, about to use it, he just immediately dies. He never gets to use the whip that made him so intimidating, because he's really just a coward. But then I found out in the bonus features that it's really because Dave Bautista was terrible with the whip, so they never bothered. In part 1, when Paul begins to manipulate the prophecy, Jessica whispers, "Careful." In part 2, when Paul takes full advantage of the prophecy, Jessica whispers, "Slow down." Both part 1 and part 2 even end with Paul having a one-on-one duel to the death, both at sunrise, and with some of the same witnesses, both with no music during the fight, and both featuring the same line of dialogue, "May thy knife chip and shatter," to begin the fight. There's a moment in this that was the first time I have ever felt in a film what it feels like the moment you fall in love with someone. When Paul is staring at Zendaya while she explains to him how a wind trap works, and the way she looks is exactly how someone looks when you fall in love with them. I don't know how Denis pulled that off, but he did. I find it absolutely hilarious that the final trailer for this featured the line, "You are not prepared for what is to come." And most of us thought that was Rebecca Ferguson speaking. But because it's whisper voice, we had no idea it was literally Anya Taylor-Joy in the trailer. LOL. This is by far Timothée Chalamet's best performance to date. I have never been a huge fan of Zendaya, but I am now. She is fantastic in this. And Rebecca Ferguson and Javier Bardem completely steal every scene they're in. And I loved Javier's Donald Duck impression. But Zendaya, that last shot, that lip whimper alone deserves her an Oscar, I'll tell you what. And everything on Giddy Prime was absolutely astounding. I would vacation there anytime. Those weird fireworks things? That's the kind of amazing design that I don't even know how people come up with. But it's astounding to see all the science fiction design in these two films, especially in this one. Absolutely breathtaking. Things like the mines hidden in the sand, then flying towards the vehicle and exploding. I've never seen anything like that. Incredible. And for weeks, I have been joking. Well, let me start over. For months, I have been willing to bet the farm that there would be a part 3. And that it was already a done deal. So for weeks, I've been joking. Part 1 ends with Zendaya saying the final line, "This is only the beginning." So it would be funny if they ended part 2 with her saying, "This is only the middle." But as soon as she said something in particular, I perked up at the thought and thought to myself, is that going to be her last line? And sure enough, it was. So I actually got what I asked for, as the last thing Zendaya says in part 2 is, "This isn't over yet." Ironically enough, this film felt to me very much like Episode 2, Attack of the Clones. Setting up a war to lead into the climax. And ironically enough, Episode 2 even ends with Count Dooku saying, "This is merely the beginning." And the last line of Episode 2 is Yoda saying, "Begun, the Clone Wars have." In Dune Part 2, Zendaya has the final line of the film, In Dune Part 1, Zendaya has the final line of the film, and then it cuts to Rebecca Ferguson as the last shot. In Dune Part 2, Rebecca Ferguson has the final line of, "The Holy War begins." And then it cuts to Zendaya as the final shot. I can't wait for Dune Messiah. And then I go on to explain how I just broke the record for most viewings in a theater and end it with Long Live the Fighters. Or should I say, Adam Nashia Santa. But yeah, that pretty much makes part 1, episode 1, The Phantom Menace. Part 2 is episode 2, Attack of the Clones. Denis Villeneuve is clearly a fan because it's the same exact ending. Viewing the armies heading up out into space to start a war. It's exactly how Dune Part 2 and Star Wars Episode 2 end. And they both have the exact same final line. Begun the Clone Wars have, the Holy War begins. That's not a coincidence or an accident. Because those of you who know the book, Dune Messiah, spoiler alert, Dune Messiah is going to have the same ending as Star Wars Episode 3. Anyway, just wanted to get that out there. Those are all of my collective thoughts on the film, even though I'll continue to have more with each viewing, because it really is one of the greatest achievements in cinema history. Follow me on Letterboxd at Paul Charman, the Muad'Dib. Little picture of Captain Murphy from C-Lab 2021. My 4 favorites being There Will Be Blood, Tron Legacy, Ladyhawke, and Dune Part 2. Okie dokie.